All right, I'm excited to talk with Tanna Fox today about why fermented foods are really the health hack that your brain and your body need in 2024. This really is something that's near and dear to both of our hearts. And so I'll start with an introduction. I'm Dr. Scott Noorda. I studied neuroscience at BYU and then went to medical school in Chicago, family medicine residency in Houston. And then I got to work in memory care facilities for a while, and that continued my interest in brain health, but started my journey into kind of what else was out there and found functional medicine and led me down the path that I'm on now. So my wife and I have 5 kids, and we live in St. George and have our functional medicine clinic here. And my passion is just learning about and teaching about brain health, about gut health, about how we can optimize our ability to kind of make an impact and have an influence on the world and longevity. So I'll just start my introduction for you, Tanna. Tanna is an international sports certified nutritionist and also an expert on fermented foods. And so I'll let you just share a little bit more, Tanna, about what you do and a little bit about your background.
Well, thanks, Scott. I'm so excited to be here and chat with you today. You've inspired so many people, and I just love all the content you teach. And so it was so fun to see your teaching post about fermented foods. And so it's just always been something that I've been curious about. Like you said, I'm a certified international sports science nutritionist. I started out working in the realm with athletes and just really improving speed and quality of muscle mass and losing body fat. And as I kept going down this route, I loved it and I still love it. But I was introduced to these fermented foods, and the intrigue came because I noticed that anytime these athletes or even a client of any kind wanted to improve their mental capacity along with the physical capacity, I was so amazed that every time I learned about these fermented foods or the gut, that they really were so closely linked. So I love that you have a background in the brain too, because that's truly why we do all of this, is for the mental clarity, right? For the longevity. So I have been practicing nutrition for probably 10 years. I've worked with clients one-on-one for about 8 or 9. And I mean, I started kefir back in the day, like 10 years ago, when no one had even heard of it. Even my mom was like, "You leave milk on your counter for overnight? Don't you know it's going to get rotten?" I'm like, I know. It does sound kind of like witch doctor, but it truly is such a great thing to add to our diets to just improve our health and our brain capacity.
I love that. Yeah, milk kefir is actually probably one of the first fermented foods that Amy and I got into too. And it's an acquired taste. I kind of mentioned in my post, like fermented foods for me were kind of a love-hate. Like I love the idea of it. I really didn't like the taste of it for a while. And then it grows on you. And then I found myself starting to crave it and love it and enjoy how it makes me feel. And so anyway, I love that you have your milk kefir right there. That's so fun.
I've got it all, Scott. I'm so excited to talk about it
That's
all.
awesome. Okay. Well, let's dive in a little bit to kind of background. So understanding fermented foods a little bit better. Fermented foods are key to so many parts of our health, and really they're key to our gut health, which then kind of spreads throughout the body. So it affects our mental health, our overall brain health, our skin, our bone health. I've talked about connection of gut microbiome and bone health and osteoporosis, other inflammatory conditions, so many things. So today what we're going to talk about is kind of why your brain and your body need fermented foods, what fermented foods are, in case we don't know. And often they're just foods that we don't think about or don't recognize as fermented foods. And then how to start incorporating them into your diet. And that's why I'm excited that Tanna's here with us. So you can kind of help us understand, make this a practical sort of application of how do I do this when either I don't think I like it or it just sounds really hard to do. And then you also get to talk and teach us about kind of how to make it yourself. And I love that you're coming to us from your kitchen so you can kind of make this real for us and what it looks like, to also what to look for, I should say, when you're buying fermented foods. So I'm going to let you talk first and just kind of give us an overview of what fermented foods are.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I think I love fermented foods. And I mean, we can even cover this. Maybe you can answer this question better later, because sometimes I know when people know about probiotics, they instantly go think that it's like a pill, right? Or a supplement right away. And there's many different forms. You can buy them anywhere from Trader Joe's to Walmart to some really high-end health stores. But probiotics are so much more than just a supplement. And in fact, we know that they're actually a lot more effective when they get inside and they're attached to food. And so, and I love food, being a nutritionist, it's like my favorite thing to talk about. So I have learned and come to study that there's the three types of food that I love to talk about when it comes to probiotics are going to be kefir. And you're right, this was how I started too. This was the easiest way to start. So if anyone's ever thinking, oh, I can't do it or I can't make it, not only is it more cost effective, but it's 10 times healthier. If you can get up to anywhere from 30 to 60 additional strains of good bacteria in a homemade kefir versus a store-bought, which the most I've ever found contains about 15. So kefir is the first type of fermented food. That's probably the easiest to start with. But then the next one, and this one's probably pretty familiar to a lot of people too, is this kombucha. Sometimes, this again was a little bit more of like a weird health food thing, but now you can get this also, I mean, even from Walmart to Target, they carry this. This also contains a totally different variety of probiotic strains than the kefir will contain. And then the third probiotic food are going to be cultured vegetables. At the store, you might see sauerkraut or kimchi. I love to make, this jar, this is like a blueberry, spinach, kefir, lemon kraut that probably took no less than 5 minutes to just throw in a jar, add a little fermentation, seal it up, leave it on the counter for a few days. But I've got tomatoes. I do make a salsa that it doesn't even last a day in my house. It goes so fast. This is one of my favorites, is just these fermented lemons. You can put on anything, but these are the three types of food that I have learned contain this full spectrum of probiotics. Because I think sometimes, and again, correct me or jump in anytime here, doctor, but sometimes we think it's more CFUs, right? More number of bacteria. But I have learned that in really achieving a good gut microbiome, it's all about the diversity of the different strains you get.
Definitely. Yeah, it's certainly CFU, the number of bacteria is important and it's helpful, but you're right, it's more about diversity than it is about quantity.
Yeah. And so I just love that these really are so simple to make. And we can talk about how to make them in just a second. I'll show you easy stuff. But I do think that if you ever are going to try this, like you said, it is kind of a little scary. People are like, okay, I know I'm supposed to. I know it's great, but what do I do? How do I start? The thing that I hope people understand is that it actually is not going to be a drastic dietary change. All we have to do is think about how to add a little bit of at a time into each meal. Like, for example, if you like yogurt for the most part, I'm pretty sure you're going to like kefir, right? It tastes exactly like it. To a certain degree. It can sometimes be a little bit more effervescent. But if you are worried about that, my favorite way is just to pour it in a smoothie. I don't know. Are you a smoothie kefir guy too?
Yeah, that's definitely how I had to start. I had to only have it in a smoothie and start with a little bit and then slowly increase to kind of get used to that.
Yeah. You and my kids are the same way. They were like, what, mom? But sometimes I'll just they got to the point where I would just blend it up with like a little bit of honey and pour it back in this jar. And I was always sweetening with like a banana. So this one, I don't know if you can see it close. There's blueberries in there.
Yeah.
Favorite. Bananas are a favorite. A little bit of honey. And then you can even eventually just start to swap it out. And your kids with time and us won't know. And they say, correct me too if you have a different stat, but I know that it takes about 15 times for us to be introduced to a food before we actually start to acquire that taste. Maybe as adults, it's not that many, but for kids, for sure it is. So just don't give up and keep trying, a little bit at a time. And I think the coolest part about these fermented foods, again, back on, the idea of it doesn't have to totally change the way you eat, but that in order to start out to get some of the gut benefits from kefir, you only need about a half a cup a day. So again, throw that in your smoothie. With the kombucha, this stuff is powerful and it's got some really great bacteria. You only need a quarter cup of the kombucha. So I will nurse this whole bottle, for a week or 10 days. The first time I had it, I drank the whole thing in my car. And I remember being like, oh, I kind of have a hot belly. Well, my cheeks are a little warm. Like, what's going on? But it is just a really good variety of those probiotic strains. And then the best part is these little cultured vegetables. Some of these ones that might look a little bit more intimidating, it's 2 tablespoons. That's how potent this stuff is. And even if you just start out a couple times a week, it really is a little bit easier to kind of get some of these probiotic foods into our diet.
I love that. Thank you. It feels already a little bit more approachable, I think, for a lot of people. And I love that idea. Sometimes I think people confuse the idea of like pickled and fermented, right?
Totally.
And for me, growing up, I loved pickles, but I didn't really, it was vinegar and sometimes sugar and cucumbers. And
Yeah.
so the idea of fermenting is that it actually sort of gives that vegetable, that dairy, whatever it is, sort of adds in so much nutritional value. And for vegetables, it's really just salt, right? Is that typically what you're adding into yours?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. When I do like these lemons, especially for someone that maybe has a dairy intolerance and they can't do like a whey kefir or something like that, it literally is just salt. And that's the
Mm.
beauty of it. It's antibacterial, antimicrobial, it preserves it. These lemons, like this, for example, anyone can make these. You slice up these lemons, put them in a jar with some filtered water and add maybe 2 tablespoons of salt. And you're thinking, that's a lot of salt. But the salt actually becomes absorbed into this food. And then you get this yummy, soft lemon where you can eat the rind and put it on top of salmon or chicken. I put them all over my salads. But this is just salt. Some of the other fermented foods, well, and actually the honey, I saw, we talked, or there was a mention of some fermented honey. This one is just garlic, honey, salt, and then a tiny bit of a culture. So some of the other vegetables, like if I ever make the tomatoes or some of the krauts, you can add a culture into a live bacteria, and that would be a whey culture. I don't know. Have you ever, when you take your kefir, have you ever separated your kefir into curds and whey?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's exactly what you use to start the fermented vegetables. So you can take this kefir, for those of you that aren't familiar, you can take this milk kefir, and you can also make coconut kefir and almond milk kefir too. For those people, I love a coconut milk kefir with like some mangoes in it. I mean, there is some yummy recipes that you can put, but if you wanted to get a little bit more of like a concentrated kefir, like a kefir cheese, which is like the consistency of a sour cream, you can strain your kefir with a coffee filter in kind of like a glass bowl, and it separates, like little Miss Muffet eating her curds and whey, right? You get this thick concentrated kefir cheese, and then you get all the whey. So this is literally liquid whey. And when you want to make a cultured vegetable, you chop up your veggies, put them in the jar, adds lots of salt, and then you can add this fermented or this whey, and this is what will ferment the cultured vegetables and add even more and a bigger variety of the different strains of bacteria. So salt or whey, and if you don't really ever want to strain your kefir, or you're not ready to make kefir yet, but you're like, oh, I think I want to try some cultured vegetables, this packet, this is like this cutting edge cultures. I actually just grabbed these on Amazon, but you can set these in a little tiny cup with a little bit of water, and you just pour in a little quarter teaspoon into whatever the salsa, we've even made cultured lemonade before. We'll make a lemonade, fresh lemons, some sugar in there. What ferments it is the bacteria and then some kind of food source, like a sugar is usually like, that's what the sugar and the lactose from the milk ferments it, or the fruit, like the blueberry in here ferments it. There's definitely some sugar in lemons too. So it's so cool, the process, that again, you probably understand that actual process even more than I do, but I just love the result that it beefs up the nutritional value of the food and then adds so many more digestive enzymes to our gut, so that when we do eat other foods or need to process sugar or breads, it breaks it down. And so we're creating a better and more beautiful digestive health system, not just, increasing, our brain capacity.
I love that transition because that really helps us sort of dive into kind of the sciencey part of it for a minute. So if you're okay, we'll dive into that.
Oh, I love it. It's my favorite part.
Good, good. So what I want to talk about is why we need fermented foods. Like you mentioned, a lot of people are looking for the simple fix. Let me take a probiotic pill to kind of fix my issues, or whatever pill, right? But changing the gut microbiome doesn't happen with a probiotic pill. A lot of people have that confused. They think if I take a probiotic, that fixes my gut microbiome. The truth is it doesn't actually change your microbiome hardly at all. It works while it's in there. So it's great to use. Certainly we use probiotic supplements for a lot of different things, but it's not going to change the underlying microbiome. And so culturing and fermenting foods is really what gives us that avenue of being able to make a difference in our gut and our gut microbiome, giving us that kind of the beneficial bacteria, like you mentioned, and allowing it to kind of take residence within our gut. One study I reviewed again recently, a Stanford study comparing if you take in more prebiotic fiber, which has always been the thing that we've encouraged people to do. And there are a lot of benefits to doing that. It does feed good bacteria. But what they were looking at is how much does that change the diversity of the bacteria? And does it change inflammatory markers versus taking in fermented foods? And so it was just, it was kind of eye-opening to me to see the power of fermented foods in this study. It wasn't a big study. It was kind of a proof of concept before they dive into something bigger. I think there were like 45 people in the study, but I loved the results because it was pretty consistent across the board that there was a significant increase in the microbiome diversity. So you get a lot of different bugs in there, and they were staying in there, and it decreased the inflammatory markers. So one
Wow.
of those that it decreased was IL-6 or interleukin 6, and that's connected with like rheumatoid arthritis. It's connected with diabetes, so many inflammatory and chronic diseases. And just by eating fermented foods on a regular basis every day, you can decrease your risk of these chronic diseases or start to help reverse some of those inflammatory changes. So just such a fun one and a simple thing that we can do. And I think, Tanna, the idea we hope to get across to people, right, is that we want them to think of food not as just like, well, I'm just going to eat whatever my body is craving, or just kind of give into what the world thinks is normal as far as, or our culture thinks is normal as far as food. But really, it's about changing the way that we see food as the way that we fuel ourselves, the way that we sort of, people talk about food as medicine. I
Yeah.
guess that's one way to think of it. Although most people don't like the taste of medicine. So to me, it doesn't sound very exciting, but really changing your idea of food from I eat it just because it makes my mouth happy versus I eat it because it gives me nourishment. It actually changes and empowers my body.
Oh,
So
well, I think sometimes, Scott, people don't understand that a lot of times they crave those sugary foods because their gut bacteria is weak. I mean, bad bacteria in our gut feeds off of carbohydrates and sugars, simple carbs and sugars that don't have a lot of nutrient density. So if you wake up in the morning and that's kind of the first thing you go to grab, that gut bacteria is more dominant for the day. And that's going to drive what you're craving and what you're actually really wanting to eat. The good bacteria in our gut craves those prebiotics, like you just mentioned. And prebiotics are so simple. It's basically fruits and vegetables, right? All those colors and the fiber that is in those fruits and vegetables is what feeds the probiotics. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because with time, if you're feeling like, oh, this doesn't taste good, I don't crave it, I'm really wanting that cinnamon roll, or I'm really just wanting like a bowl of cereal or something that's not terrible, but just maybe not from the earth. I think with time and a little bit of practice of just adding some of these things, eventually you can shift your gut microbiome enough that you will stop craving so much sugar. And you'll go to the grocery store and you'll look around and you'll be like, oh, why do I feel like I'll grab this asparagus today, or I'll grab the kale? I think my body's low in vitamin A, right? Or what nutrients? And you really can shift the gut bacteria with the food you eat, so those cravings actually go away. And I think that's the coolest part about it all, is that when that gut bacteria is alive and well, you actually do want to eat better. You have more energy. I mean, we know, and again, you again, you can probably explain this much better than I can, but I think my initial draw to these was learning how that vagus nerve from our gut to our brain really does talk to each other. And it's like, okay, 90% of the serotonin, which is that, I mean, what is the serotonin? Is it, help me, it's the sleep, it's the feel good hormone, right?
Yep.
Our happiness. That isn't like a willpower thing. Like, I've just got to be happier. I've just got to like make better choices, whatever. That drives from our gut bacteria. And I think that for me is like, what, one more little help to just have a better day? Sure, I'll try some of these foods, you know?
Yeah, and I love that. I love that. That's so true. The craving, and that's where we sometimes people like self-identify with that craving, right? Like, I am a person who likes
Yeah.
sugar, or I am this person, right? But it's really like the bugs in my gut are these, right? And so that
Are
is making that shift. Yeah, to where you're saying, okay, if I want to crave the things that are nutritious, I need to put those things into my body and feed the bacteria that does well with those things. And over time, it's not an immediate process. You're not going to drink kefir once or twice or 3 times and start craving it,
Yeah.
right? But over time, that shift happens. And as you decrease the simple sugars, simple carbs, super processed, highly processed foods, and start feeding with more complex carbohydrates and these fermented foods and vegetables, then it totally shifts that gut microbiome. And it does so many things for us, right? It allows us to, like, it changes the way that our food's digested in the gut. So we have this amazing symbiotic relationship with the gut bugs, the bugs in our gut, this microbiome. It actually allows us to absorb more of the nutrients from the food that we eat, which is awesome. It decreases, because it helps us digest better, the right bacteria, then we get less bloating, less discomfort. It allows us to kind of have improved overall gut health. And sometimes what people will find, if I eat like fermented foods, especially fermented vegetables, and they get that bloating and discomfort, usually that means there's an overgrowth of another type of bacteria in there, probably migrated up into the small intestine, and now there's probably something we need to do about it. And a lot of that has to do with just really making significant digestive or nutritional changes, I should say, to start to shift that. And doing things as simple as changing the types of foods that you eat is a big part of that. So that's a part of it. Let's also talk about other things that the bacteria can affect. So there's growing evidence for the way that those bugs themselves affect our mental health, our hormones, our hormone balance, and endocrine systems. I talk a ton about the brain, of course, and so we see research pouring in on the way that the gut microbiome affects our risk for cognitive decline. So let's just talk about a couple of those. First, mental health. You mentioned this with serotonin and the amount of serotonin, most of it being made in the gut and then kind of transferring up into the brain. And there, in our reel that we did, we kind of talked about the study that was the Annals of General Psychiatry, and they were looking at probiotic supplements. But basically what they found is that increasing the gut microdiversity actually decreases your risk for depression. It decreases depression scales or reported scales by people who are already struggling with depression. Other studies are showing decreased anxiety, decreased ADD symptoms.
Wow.
So it definitely has this direct connection. And the other part of that with the brain is our sort of cognitive performance. So I love the studies on this, and you'll appreciate this as a sports scientist as well, that this ability to sort of use food to improve not only our physical performance, but also our cognitive performance. So some of the wording I thought was just really cool in here. This was in the journal Nutrients in 2020. And what they were looking at is cognitive flexibility, like I said. So they're talking about your ability to kind of adapt in different environments, and also your executive function. So specifically visual spatial memory. So being able to visualize where you are in space and navigate all of that, your verbal memory. So verbal recall, learning things from if you hear them and being able to remember them. And then kind of attentional vigilance. So being able to, again, tying back to that ADD, your ability to kind of pull in sensory information and other inputs and being able to remain kind of in a state of vigilance and attention despite distractions. So I just love this idea that you can fuel your brain, you can change potentially what might be a diagnosis for you, or at least improve it, something like ADD, depression, anxiety, cognitive decline, brain fog, by just bringing in more consistently a host of these fermented foods.
All of that, I'm sure with your patients you've noted too, but depression and anxiety are on the rise like never before. And so to know that we have at least a little bit of a tool in our back pocket to try to combat this, especially with our youth, that where sometimes, like I've heard even sometimes in medical school, they don't even have the full nutrition class. So I'm sure in the health classes at school, they don't talk and teach about, some of these things. So I just love that you're sharing those kinds of studies and the effects that these can have on really truly improving the way that our clarity, our brain fog, our capacity, our overall human performance. We all underestimate until it's gone, right?
So true. Okay, we kind of dove into a little bit before of how to make these fermented foods. I want to give you a chance if you want to add any additional information there to kind of give people some practical takeaway from this. And then also that idea of like, how do I even know if a food's fermented when I go to a grocery store, right?
Oh,
I
yes,
have so many patients who ask me that question. They're like, I looked at the 27 different pickles there and I had no idea what I was looking for.
yes, no, I'm so glad that too, because it's true. Fermented foods, they're probably more intimidating to make than they are to buy initially. So when you go to the store, I have a couple stores and I'm not quite sure in St. George or where people are at, but more often than not, people know and recognize a Whole Foods. They have them. Sprouts, local to Utah, Earth's Best. I mean, there's a lot of really good health food stores. One of the key things to try to remember when you're buying a fermented food at the grocery store is to remember it needs to be refrigerated, because you'll see krauts on the shelf, right? And I'm like, oh, no, it has to be in a refrigerated section because it's alive. Like even right now as we talk, you can't hear it, of course, but these little jars are literally talking. They're like because they're alive. So when I look for kraut at the grocery store, you'll find, especially now because kombucha and things like that are on the rise, they're becoming more popular. A lot of people are taking them, making them, and then slapping a label on it and thinking they're selling it. But it's technically, even if it says live cultures in the ingredients, it's actually not a living food unless it states somewhere else on the bottle or the jar that it's living or raw, like right up here on this one. This one will say raw right off the bat. Active is another great word, like they put on the back. And so even if you see in the back that it will say organic or probiotic, some ingredient, the ingredients list is one thing, but a lot of the times what they're doing is they're taking these ingredients, and because of our government system, which is fine, it keeps us safe, but they have to pull it out, divide it up, measure it, quantify it, preserve it, put it back in the jar so that it's more shelf stable. We lose a lot of the live probiotics when they're in the heat. And so I always love to make sure that I buy a probiotic food that says somewhere else besides the ingredients list that it's raw, living, alive, or cultured. Like active cultures is another popular one. So in any kind of food, you'll see, you got to look for that additional marker besides just the ingredients.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, at least in St. George, we have natural grocers. We see it in Harmon's. That's the great thing. Even Costco, right? We're getting these fermented foods that are now becoming more accessible. So I love that tip of looking for raw or alive or cultured or some term that it's refrigerated. Those make such a difference.
Yes, that'll really help. And by the way, this one, I don't know if you've tried this yet, this wild brine, this is one of my favorites. Have you tried their dill garlic?
Yeah, I have. It's awesome.
This is my favorite one of all. This is the one I'm like, okay, if sauerkraut or kimchi seems a little scary to try, I will dollop maybe 2 tablespoons of this into the corner of a sandwich. And that's the thing to remember too, is if it's new to you, you don't have to make the whole thing taste like this sauerkraut sandwich that you're not going to want to eat. So just stick it in the corner, eat that bite first. There's your 2 tablespoons, or even start with 1 just to start. And then you can finish your meal and enjoy it. That's probably one of my biggest ways to introduce people into practicing this. And like you said already, it's not going to change overnight and you're not going to love these overnight, but the consistency is really what's critical over the quantity, right? Like you'll think, okay, I had a day where I had all 3 of the trilogy, I ate everything, but then you don't eat it again for 2 weeks. Because they're transient bacteria, they're going to grow and they're going to shrink, they're alive, they're kind of feeding off what else is in there or dying. If there's too many fake sweeteners or too many, over-the-counter drugs, sometimes those gut bacteria, even if they're attached to food, don't always get a chance to live. So I think looking for it, if people ever want to try, there's a seller on Amazon called Mr. and Mrs. Kefir. And I kind of just love that name. I think that's so cute. I wish I could meet them one day, but I pulled out what it looks like. If you ever want to start making kefir, these are my kefir grains. You're familiar with those too. These are the same grains that can make dairy kefir, coconut milk, and almond milk kefir. But because the coconut and almond milk don't contain lactose the same way that milk kefir does, you actually have to do at least 1 milk kefir fermentation every 3 or 4 times you make an almond milk or a coconut milk. But then these grains beef back up with the lactose that helps feed the fermentation process, and you can make it. But these are so great. Usually, simply just to put it so people kind of get how easy it is, you literally take your grains, and you put them into a clean jar like this, and then fill it up with milk. This is just Costco. Costco milk is great. They have a really good standard for buying products. Even if there's a small trace of hormone, even if it's not an organic milk, they will pull it out. And then you just put a lid. I always use plastic because sometimes metal, like unless it's stainless steel, can contaminate the potency and the strength of bacteria. And then this just sits on your counter out of direct sunlight for 24 hours, and that's it. I mean, you're familiar with this process, but it's that simple. The next day, after 24 hours, you'll start to see kind of some white pockets, which are the whey kind of separating. You take off the lid, and then you use your same little strainer, pour it over another fresh jar, and then you've got your keeper, and you start all over again. So it's kind of a daily thing every 24 hours if people just kind of want to start to know, like, what is this? And you'll forget about it, and you'll over ferment it, and then you'll wonder. But that's kind of what, at least I'm happy to be here for. I mean, anyone's welcome to send me messages. If I could show you how many cool pictures I have of people's kefir for the first time. Okay, how does this look? Is this fermented? But I would love to be able to help anyone or guide anyone as they're going down this cultured food, journey, taking those first few steps. It can be intimidating. And I mean, I watched, again, this was so new that I watched probably 5 or 6 YouTube videos. It's like, okay, pause, play. Okay, how did they do that? Okay, oh wait, I gotta pause it again. What do they do? But now more and more, I mean, you can even find it in the stores, which is great, but it's a very simple process that just takes a tiny bit of engagement, and then you start to pick it up. And the next thing you know, you don't even think about it, and these foods are already in your diet.
Yeah, I love that. Like you talked about, I think sometimes we get overwhelmed. And so we feel like, well, I have to be like, they see somebody like you, Tanna, and they're like, man, she ferments all these different things. And so I just, I'll never get there. It's too overwhelming. But I love how simple you just made that. Just you pour the milk in, you leave it for 24 hours, and then you just use it. And you only have to use a little bit at a time. You can save it in the fridge for a little while if you want to. It does continue to ferment, right, a little bit. And so you get a little bit more fermentation, but just try things. If it's too intimidating to make something, then sauerkraut is a really easy one. Just to give you an idea, because a lot of people think like kids aren't going to like this stuff. I'll let my kids maybe they can try it when they're older. The sooner you introduce it to them, the better, because that's starting to shift and change their gut bacteria. Our youngest son, he's 7 years old. He asked for 2 things for Christmas in his stocking.
Oh no.
He asked for a little bit of balsamic vinegar because he loves to put it on everything. And he asked for a little thing of sauerkraut.
Oh my God.
And we were like, okay, this is great. And he was pumped, and he eats it on everything. So, it's not something that like kids can eat this, adults can eat it. You can eat it in a lot of different things. We use it in our Mexican food. Like I love tacos, homemade tacos and rice bowls and other things. And so you can put it in that. You can put it on your eggs. You can use it in like the more traditional German route, like if you're doing a chicken or Polish sausage or something like that, you can do it that way, right? So I don't know, any other last thoughts of like, how do you start this process?
I think if I had one little tip of advice, it would just be like, take what you're already eating and look at what you can add to it versus thinking you have to find a new recipe that's just a probiotic recipe. But all the food you already have in your day, if you love a sandwich, if you love an avocado toast, like you said, if you love eggs, just look at what you've got and how can I add to versus feeling like you have to take away or shift or change. And then honestly, education, knowledge is power. Just learn a little bit more about it and then kind of let some of this stuff sink in, and you'll find yourself naturally inclined to wanting to add these things versus feeling like a guilt or like a shame if you don't. I think that's always the worst way to feel like, oh, I have to do this. I don't want to, but I will. And then you never do. But once you understand a little bit more, which is why this was so fun to do together, because I think hopefully people understand and see that there are so many benefits that really will pay off in priceless ways, and that it's actually something kind of simple. So thank you so much for this chance to sit and chat about some of our favorite things.
Oh, I love it. And thank you for coming to us from your kitchen just to make it feel so real. Again, Tanna is amazing. Certainly look into her and the post that she does and all the education that she shares. And Tanna, if you'll give us just a second, give us your kind of the easiest way for people to connect with you, and we'll certainly tag you in what we put on, what we post. But what's the easiest way for people to kind of connect with and learn from you?
Well, I try to be pretty good. I feel like I'm so grateful for more and more. I'm grateful for Instagram. I used to kind of feel daunted by it, but I found some of the greatest people on there when people really want to know. So my Instagram handle is Motherline Nutrition. And I love it because Motherline, it's really just all about Mother Earth, and that the things we need will come from the earth. And send me a DM or a question or pictures or whatever. I'm happy to send Amazon links. It truly is. I don't have a massive like interaction with a big population. So I'm able to really get and just talk with people individually. And that's really what it's all about. If there's just one of you that wants to learn, send me a message. I'd love to take the time to show you or send you the right link or whatever, because you'll go on and then you'll teach someone and then they'll teach someone else. And it will kind of grow that way, which is also just a really fun way to look at, you know, little by little, we'll do this together and we'll change our community and we'll all be healthier and stronger. So I'm happy to help anyone that wants to reach out.
Thank you. That's so generous of you, and such a valuable tool. I hope people take advantage of. And thank you for your energy and excitement and just the fun way that you show how food can be delicious and fun. And you can come up with different mixes like you showed there. It's just such a fun way to make food part of your, not just the things that you have to do, or not just giving into typical sort of what most people eat in our culture, right? Let's redefine what health looks like through the food that we eat. So I love that. Definitely appreciate all the effort that you made in your time today.
Thank you for everything. You're incredible. All of your tips and your posts, it's so refreshing to find a doctor that understands a lot of this on a deeper level. And so I think that's why I'm just so grateful for your messages and the things that you share, because they really do make a difference in people's lives. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Awesome.